Greetings, fellow travelers. Welcome to the RPG Cave. I'm one of your hosts, the level 80 Viera scholar, Ryan Turfin, and I'm joined for the very first time on the show, believe it or not, by the level 80 Rogadon Dark Knight / Red Mage, Fiona MacKinnon. Fee, thank you so much for joining me on the show today, because we're talking about Final Fantasy XIV. So before we get into the proceedings and talking about what the topic itself, Fee, do you want to introduce yourself? Who are you? Where people know you from? How do they find you on the internet?
Absolutely. So you get, my name is Fee, or my name is Fiona MacKinnon, but my nickname is Fee. Everyone calls me Fee. You can find me over on twitch.tv/Rainix, where I stream actually a lot of Final Fantasy, and also on Speaking of Stadia, where I talk about Stadia with two of my great friends, Aaron and Jake, and Point in Progress, where I have the standard podcast that we live stream every Friday. As well, we also have a podcast that's strictly actually Final Fantasy based called Fantasy in Progress, where we talk about everything that we love about Final Fantasy. I, being a new person, we've been going through the entire kind of series. And so the next recording I believe that we're doing is Shadowbringers. We're talking about Shadowbringers. So that's the next thing that we're going to be doing. But yeah, that's where you'd know me from, is all those areas.
Very nice, very nice. Well, of course, you have the honor of being the very first guest on this show, because it's usually me and Garret. But Garrett's off this week just because, Garret doesn't really play Final Fantasy, but I thought you'd be an amazing guest since you already have a Final Fantasy podcast, which is pretty good. And I actually really love checking out some of your Twitch streams, because I love the way that you guys are tackling the main scenario quest, because you have like a big group that you're all playing together and you're experiencing the story together and all kind of reacting to the story. So I think it's actually pretty awesome to check out. So definitely make sure to check out some of Fee's streams. Well, obviously, we got to clear the dungeon of some of the trash mobs before we get into the show proper. So if you like what we do and you want to support the show, there's a number of ways to do that. Number one, you can check us out on your podcast feed of choice. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify. We're all the places you find podcasts, so subscribe to us there. If you leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, I will read it during this section of the show. Also, if you want to see our beautiful faces every single week, we do a video version of the show that goes live every Saturday morning over on YouTube, youtube.com/YumiCapri. You can check us out there. Or if you want early access to this and all of our shows, as well as some exclusive content, head on over to Patreon, patreon.com/YumiCapri. There's a little tip in the old tip jar, and out comes content. All right. Now it is time to read from the sacred texts to talk all about today's subject, and that subject is Final Fantasy XIV. I'm so happy we're finally doing this, because I've talked about it on the show many times already. I'm kind of obsessed with Final Fantasy XIV. I love it. It's one of my favorite games of this current generation, like the PS4, PS5 kind of era of consoles. And it's one of my all-time favorite RPGs. So I'm so glad to have, a fellow Final Fantasy fan on the show to kind of talk about it. So as we start with every show, I'm going to quickly jump into some fun facts, and then we're going to kind of get into our discussion about Final Fantasy XIV. And we're mostly kind of tackling this from kind of a spoilery-free kind of perspective, and also with kind of new players in mind as well. So we're going to do some kind of overview kind of stuff, because we are going to be doing a Endwalker special that is going to be coming out after I've had a chance to play the game. So look out for that. Probably towards the end of the year, you'll probably be hearing that. So obviously, the game itself originally launched on PC on September 30th, 2010 worldwide, which is kind of crazy for an MMO launch out of Japan. The original game invited players into the world of Eorzea in a conflict against the Garlean Empire and the Primals. However, the game was severely panned for all kinds of issues, like it being littered with bugs and glitches, and the play systems being very clunky and unintuitive. It was just a really hard game to play back in the day. I don't think either of us actually got a chance to really check it out, because back then I was really waiting for the PS3 version to come out, because I didn't really want to play it on PC after playing kind of Final Fantasy XI for a long time and seeing that mess on PC. So yeah. I was really interested in the game, but it was kind of a mess. After all the backlash, game director Nobunaki Kumamoto actually stood down, and producer Naoki Yoshida, also known as Yoshi P to us in the community, took over the lead role. Yoshi P knew that the game could be saved, but it would take a massive effort in order to fix the game, with the entire engine basically needed to be overhauled. Square approved this giant plan to basically scrap the game and kind of start the game from scratch, which in our industry, like, this never really happens at all in games.
Not at all.
We see stuff like No Man's Sky, for example, kind of get like the redemption treatment like this, but not in the same way. They didn't have to rebuild the entire game from scratch, and it took a number of years in order to do this. This all culminated, of course, with a world-ending event that took place in 2012, with the servers going offline for the original version of the game on November 11th of that year, which, of course, we're going to talk about it a little bit when it has to do with the story, but I love kind of how they worked that into the story. I think it's like super cool.
Insane.
Super cool lore stuff. And then last but not least, of course, this new vision of the game was realized with the release of Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn on August 27th, 2013. So that's kind of the initial setup with the game that we want to start with. But before we go any further, Fia, I just want to ask you, number one, what's your history with MMOs? Is Final Fantasy XIV your first MMO? I already know the answer to this question, but I have to ask anyways. And also, when did you get started with Final Fantasy XIV? And how did you get into the game?
Absolutely. So those are great questions. So I was actually a big fan of not Final Fantasy. My goodness. World of Warcraft. I started playing World of Warcraft when I was in high school. It was essentially all my friends. We'd be hanging out, and then at 8 p.m., just guys would like scatter, and we're like, "What are you doing?" And they're like, "We have to go raid." I'm like,
Yep.
What do you mean you have to go raid? And so a few friends and I who weren't playing at the time decided to start playing. And then I became addicted for 5 years. At the time, I was just like, I don't have a problem. Everything is fine. And then I was just like, that's 5 years of my life where I just constantly played this game. And what's funny is you mentioned that Final Fantasy XIV released in 2010. I remember people would be leaving World of Warcraft, and then they would come back 2 weeks later and they're like, this game's terrible. Yep. And I'm like, obviously, World of Warcraft's going to be here forever. Everything's going to be we see how that's going right now. And so I took a hiatus from MMOs, realizing that at one point I was raiding 6 nights a week. My life was revolving around that game. I left with, I think, 1 main and then 7 alts, and I just left everything behind, and I'm like, I need to get out of this. And so last year on Stadia, I actually started playing ESO a little bit. So for about 3 months, I played that, which was fantastic, great MMO for some people who really want a narrative, and everything is voice acted. Like just little interactions with NPCs, you get voice acting. You want to talk to someone with a very long scene, all voice acted, absolutely great. But I was like, okay, I'm going to put that back on the shelf because me and MMOs, I need to take a little bit of a separation from it before I get addicted. And then one of my co-hosts on Point in Progress, Harv, was like, hey, you like anime, right? And I'm like, yes. And he's like, you also played MMOs before. And I'm like, yes. And he's like, Final Fantasy XIV. And I'm like, over my dead body, Harv. This was a great conversation. I'm never joining this game. And I kept on putting it off, and I kept on saying, I can't do it. I just cannot do it. I cannot get addicted. I can't do this to myself. I can't do this to my job. I can't do this to my relationship, my friends, anything outside of it. And then one night I'm like, okay, you know what? I'm downloading it. It's free. I'll try it out. And then I started playing, and then I played more. And then I got through ARR, and then I'm like, okay, I guess I'm in it now. And now I have a podcast about it, and I don't have to worry too much. My boyfriend did play it for a few months. He decided that it wasn't really for him because he likes to play a little bit smaller or more tactical games, but he might jump back in later on. But it was just, once I started playing, I'm like, this is completely different. And so that was my introduction. I blame Harv. My addiction to this game, 100% Harv, and the people I get to play with. And like you said, I have had a really great opportunity to play with a group of people. And so I got to experience all of this with one person who knew everything about the game, and then the rest of us coming in saying, you know what, we want to try out this game. And now we've pretty much completed it up until Endwalker. We have 2.5 patches left, and now we're here.
That's awesome. I mean, first of all, hashtag blame Harv. It's all Harv's fault.
Hashtag blame Harv.
But I'm so glad he got you into the game because honestly, again, I've seen so much fun you've had on stream kind of playing it and getting into it. And it's definitely got a great story. It's one of the things that really kind of separates it from other MMOs, especially like as someone who played World of Warcraft for a long time, because my history with MMOs goes back pretty far. Because my first MMO was Final Fantasy XI, because at the time, because you obviously know anime, Fee, so I was really obsessed with an anime called Dot Hack Sign, back when it was kind of airing back on YTV back in the day, which was all about this kid named Tsukasa who was kind of lost in this MMO and he's kind of forced in there. But it was kind of my introduction to MMOs, because I knew like games like EverQuest had existed back then and some other MMOs, but like I never really thought about jumping into one myself until watching that anime. So it's like it came out around the same time as Final Fantasy XI was coming out, the dub version of Dot Hack. So I was like, hey, maybe I'll give this Final Fantasy game a try, especially because I like the Final Fantasy series. So maybe I'll try this new MMO. And I remember liking that game a lot, but like, I don't know if you've ever played Final Fantasy XI, but the way that game works is imagine your hotbar, but in like 12 or to 15 different submenus. It's not fun to play. It's not an experience that holds up very well. I mean, I love the world in that game, but man, it's a very hard game to play. So when World of Warcraft came out, I was in the beta for World of Warcraft Vanilla. That's kind of when I kind of started with World of Warcraft, and I played a ton of it. And I kind of fell down the same rabbit hole you did, especially in Wrath and the Lich King Cataclysm kind of era. Especially because I was dating someone at the time who was also playing, which is kind of a dangerous thing sometimes, where we would basically spend like 12 straight hours playing World of Warcraft together, and that was kind of our date for the day, which was just I had so many great memories of that era, but also it's just like I kind of had to step away from it a little bit too, just like you did. So when you were telling your story, I definitely felt that, because I could definitely fall down that rabbit hole as well. Like we did an entire episode on MMOs before, and I shared my pie chart with the show of my World of Warcraft playtime, which was like, it was at least 15,000 hours. Like I've spent 365 days in World of Warcraft, which is crazy. So I played World of Warcraft a ton. And then when Final Fantasy came out, they had another beta for Final Fantasy XIV on PS3 when A Realm Reborn was coming out. And I remember it being just free to anyone to join. So I thought, okay, let me just try this, because I was interested in trying the original version and it didn't plan out super well. And I really got into it because it was really just the full game. So I got really sucked into the story and the characters and the world of Eorzea and just really fell in love with the game. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go out and buy this game day one. And I've pretty much been playing ever since. I've been having a great time with Final Fantasy XIV. So I'm definitely the grizzled vet of Final Fantasy XIV this between the two of us. But that's kind of my history with the game as well, where again, it was just a random open beta for the game that kind of just got me into it. Once I tried it, I knew I was going to stick with it, especially because I play as a healer in 14, and I've always played as a healer, and I like kind of the healer design a lot in the game, more than a lot of other MMOs, I think. So there you go. Well, the first thing I wanted to kind of talk about with the game, now that we've talked about kind of our history with the series, of course, and kind of start diving into this, is what makes Final Fantasy XIV different from other MMOs? Because again, we've played a lot of MMOs between the two of us. And Fee, I'm going to start with you. What do you think really makes Final Fantasy XIV so different from all the other MMOs out there?
Yeah, I think it's how integrated the main story quest is and how immersed it gets you in. And also the fact that, like, for myself, when I played WoW, I had multiple characters. I had 7, 8 characters, but in this game I have 1, and I only plan on ever having 1. And even if I did decide to make an alt, it would look like my character. It would look like Lumara Stromwyn, the tallest female Rogadin that you can find, who, like, she's just essentially who I imagine that my character is. Whereas with other games, you have to have multiple different characters. You have to, like, yeah, you can do side quests to level up, but I've never experienced a game where you have to go through an entire storyline. Yes, you can buy it out, but do you really want to do that? It just allows you to get a whole sense of the actual, like, Eorzea in the story and the like immerse yourself in what's happening around you and what actually like different pieces. It's almost, and I always joked like when we got into Heaven's Ward that it was Game of Thrones. This is all Game of Thrones. I had like a black jacket. My entire like wardrobe went from colorful to just complete black gothic. Like I was a part of the wall. I was there, and I'm like, I don't think I've ever been this immersed in an MMORPG as I have even just at the lower level, let alone the lower end of the storyline. Now getting through everything up until now, it's just like my character went through this with the Scions. My character did all of this. And it's not just like, oh yeah, I leveled in this particular area and this other person says, oh yeah, I leveled up in like the Eastern Kingdom, or someone says I like did it here. It was everyone got to experience this, and you all get to experience these gains and losses, and it's just so impactful. Like some of the times that I've played through this game, I'm just sitting here crying.
Yep.
And you're just like, I don't think I've really ever experienced anything like this in an MMO before. Like you feel this a lot with like maybe a smaller indie game or a AAA game where you see these like massive characters, but never really in an MMO. And so having this experience with my character, like I said, don't think I could ever like play a different character. Like I have Fantasias because you get them during the leveling process. I don't think I ever really want to change her because I went through all of that. I experienced this with my character. And so I've never experienced that before. Like I had I was just like, whatever you can, but you can be whatever job you want. You can level up all the crafting. You could be crazy and level up absolutely every job, crafting, gathering. My fishing was the highest level for the longest time. I was sitting at like a 75 fishing at like a level 60. So I was just like going crazy, but I'm just so shocked. Like, and every time anyone asks me this or whenever I think about this, I'm just always shocked by how much of an impact that this game has had in such a short period of time. I played an MMO for 5 years, and I don't think I've ever felt such intense feelings as I did in Final Fantasy over the past 4 or 5 months.
Yeah, especially like when you get to some of the later content too, like Shadowbringers and stuff like that. Like even just little things from the story that you don't even think about in all the way back to like A Realm Reborn, like just come back to haunt you, or it just really provide an emotional experience. Because again, to your point, you really feel like a character that exists in this world. It's a different feeling than when you're the hero of the Alliance in something like World of Warcraft, where they just like, hello, hero, and then they just go and spew text at you about whatever quest you're doing. Whereas in this game, it feels like your character just exists somewhere in the world. You have a house, maybe, if you could afford a house, or an apartment or whatnot, and you're a character that is just as real as the other Scions are, or just like any of the other characters you'll meet along the way, which again is just adds so much more player agency, and also just really adds to the investment of that character as well. Whereas like you, I really didn't change my class for my race for the longest time. And it really wasn't until they added Vera in Shadowbringers that I actually decided to do that. One, because I've always wanted to be a bunny girl inside, but I actually really like the look of that race, and I'm glad that they finally added, because that's a race I kind of wanted from the beginning, being a longtime Final Fantasy fan. So that's kind of who I identify my Warrior of Light as being. But at the same time, I love that even though you and I have like very different play experiences as far as our characters are concerned, it's like we play very different jobs from each other as far as our main jobs are concerned. We still feel like that we have kind of the same investment out of the story, and our character still feels like the same part of the world. And I love that about this game, where it just feels more like a BioWare RPG, something like Mass Effect or something like that, where our main character really feels more like a Commander Shepard versus just a random hero that's just going to save the day whenever they need us to do that kind of thing. So,
exactly. Yeah.
I love that. But yeah, so that's kind of what I think makes it a little bit different from other MMOs. So let's just dive into the story real quick. So I touched on it a little bit in the intro, and again, we're not going to get too spoilery, because ultimately, I mean, Final Fantasy XIV has the greatest free trial of any game I've ever seen, and definitely if you want to start with the game, that's the one place I would always say to go start, is with the free trial, and it actually gives you both the base game and the Heaven's Ward expansion, so that's like...
Which is insane.
It's like 200 hours of content right there, essentially. So there's just a ton of story to unpack, especially because like each expansion in a way feels like it's its own game. It's got its own flavor to it. It's got its own kind of beyond kind of the places you're exploring. The story itself just feels different. With each expansion, it almost again feels like its own experience. But with the story itself, I really love the pacing with the story, the great writing, the dialogue. I think is really excellent. And again, I think it's got one of the strongest modern Final Fantasy stories out of all the Final Fantasy games that I've played with it that have been released after something like Final Fantasy IX, which I think is one of the best stories in all the Final Fantasy games. So I really love the story in Final Fantasy XIV. I know we've yammered on about kind of how much we love the story in this game, and that's mainly the reason to go in there. And just like you were describing as well, I also was a blubbering mess many times throughout the story, especially because I know on stream you recently did 5.3, and I was a wreck after playing that. So
I had a cry counter. I got up to 17 different times during that patch because I just couldn't handle it. And just because there was just so many, like there was certain parts, and obviously we're not going to spoil anything. There were certain things where it made you face everything that had happened. Like there's certain things that have gone on, and like it just makes you think. And not even just like the things that were happening in the game, but the things that were being said where you're just like, oh, you have to really think about like maybe where, like, why am I better? Or what am I doing that's better than what other people are doing? And so it's just, I don't even understand. Like, I think one thing also as well, and for people who do want to come into the game and really want to, like, I'm not trying to diss any other class, but the Dark Knight storyline quest is probably one of the best pieces of storytelling I've probably seen in a video game. And I can say this hands down because the amount of things that have happened, because I'm like, okay, it's story quests, like cool, whatever. Like it's the class quests, like they don't put that much thought and effort into it. The person who wrote the Dark Knight quests storyline is actually the main writer for Shadowbringers, and also is working on Endwalker. And that's how much impact that particular storyline. Like, I don't think, like, she definitely is a phenomenal person. And I goodness gracious, I wish I knew her name off the top of my head, but she's absolutely phenomenal. So, gosh, there's just so many things where I'm just like, how does this go from this to this? And that it's just so nuts. And even just some of the things that you do, or the type of actual job you select, may change the way that people react, like kind of like storylines or like things that you can say, because even some of the people I was playing with who said, hey, I only had 2 voice options, you had 3. And the way that you react to, like, where you start, because I started as a paladin, so I was a gladiator, like I had different reactions and different interactions with Robon and other characters from that area, but they had different reactions when we were over in Gridania. So it's really cool to see that. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry I'm gushing so much about it, but it's just it's so insane how it's like this, like, and so many people, especially myself, slept on it for so long. And so I really hope that people who are listening take the opportunity. You get like Heaven's Word, which is probably one of the best expansions. Like Shadowbringers was fantastic, but up until like Shadowbringers, Heaven's Word was hands down my favorite expansion. So you get it for free. There's no reason not to try it out.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of people just kind of sleep on it too, or not necessarily know that the free trial's out there, even though there's the meme out there that everyone always is like, we're just
the critically acclaimed MMORPG Final Fantasy XIV, free up to 60 with the main original, like the base game plus Heaven's Word, and it's a whole list. Like we constantly are quoting it, and
that's so good. And also, I have to definitely agree with you. I'm glad you brought up the Dark Knight questline, because I actually ended up leveling a Dark Knight, because normally I don't really love tanks. Like tanks kind of the role that I'm not super confident in. And I leveled up a Dark Knight just so I could play it, because I'd heard so many great things about it. And just once I got into kind of the Dark Knight story, I got really invested in it. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that the storyline was incredible for it. Whereas just my main class is a scholar, which is a healer. And I liked the class quest from it, but they weren't nearly as interesting as the Dark Knight ones, that's for sure. Like it was fine. It was really cool about how like it gave more lore to how the Tonberries kind of exist in the world of Final Fantasy XIV, because Tonberries have existed all the way back in like the oldest of old Final Fantasy games. But learning about how they kind of exist in this world was really cool, and how that tied into the Scholar quest line. And all of the class quest lines kind of do something similar, where they're kind of giving you more history on certain things in the world, or more perspective on different events or other things like that. So I love how they enhance the experience, even if some of them are kind of hit or miss with their storytelling. I like at least what they add to your character and kind of the role that you're taking on while you're taking on that job, which I've always really appreciated about those quests as well. So there you go. Yeah, the story is fantastic. Go into it, especially like I've always told people that this is the type of game where if it wasn't an MMO, but it had the same story and maybe it was like an action RPG or something like that, like this is the type of game that would be talked about in Game of the Year lists every year, or every time a new expansion would come out, or it's a game that I think like people would really fall in love with. But it's just, I know that it's harder to get into because it is a bigger time investment, admittedly, than a lot of other games, especially like to get to the end of the Shadowbringer story. Like, how long did it take you to get to like where you are now, Fee?
Months.
Like that's
months.
Yeah. People joke that Persona 5 is like one of the longest, RPGs out there, but like Persona 5 has got nothing on Final Fantasy XIV as far as, how long it takes to get through its story. But the fact that we're gushing about the story even after playing that much of the story, like, just goes to show just how strong the writing is and how well it's paced. Even though, again, there are some down points in ARR, like when you're going to like kind of the level 30 quests, for example, and stuff like that, kind of meander a little bit. So there is that, but that's just the issue with the times, like when that came out. So it kind of makes a little bit of sense. So. One thing we always like to talk about on the RPG Cave is the mechanics of whatever series or game that we're talking about. So I kind of want to dive into the mechanics of Final Fantasy XIV, because definitely they've really evolved over time, especially like looking at, even if you go back and watch old videos of ARR content, for example, and having to worry about TP as a resource, for example, was like, There were so many like systems layered on top of each other in the original release that now I think everything's kind of streamlined in a really good way. So obviously, if you've never played it before, if you haven't really dove into MMOs, essentially it plays very similarly to a game like Final Fantasy XII, where you have your character auto attacks, and then you have abilities on cooldown. And depending on what job you have, those abilities, you basically cycle between either 1 or 2 rotations of attacks, and then you usually have a bunch of other cooldowns and other abilities that will either buff damage or buff your party's defense, or depending on what kind of role that you're kind of in. That's kind of how combat kind of works. But what I found interesting about combat in 14 specifically, that's kind of different from other MMOs, is that when there are larger attacks, like telegraphed attacks, for example, there's usually like an orange cone or a circle on the ground that kind of indicates to you where the attack is going to take place. And as long as you make sure you're outside of that circle before the animation plays, you can then move back into that cone or that circle as it plays, and you basically dodge the attack, which I think it took me a little bit of time to kind of get used to that idea, especially because it's so different from other MMOs like World of Warcraft. But I do really like the design of that, because I think it makes the game feel a little more strategic, or they can go kind of more over the top with some of the animations and attacks that the boss enemies have. But so I really like that. But what do you think about the combat in this game, Fee?
I really enjoy it. It runs a lot more fluid than a lot of other fighting games, even like fighting games and MMOs that I've played. Because when it came to things like, when I played WoW, I was actually I just healed all the time. Like I did have some DPS, and I started to branch off into playing Death Knight, which is probably why I like Dark Knight so much. But they thought about the process and how the mechanics worked and the way that your characters move around. One of my favorite things, and I think this is why I'm really enjoying hopping into Red Mage when I have to do dungeons, is because the mechanics of being able to summon, just being able to throw fire attacks and be able to balancing out, then just jump in, do a bunch of attacks. There's a video of me doing melee, and then I just say bye-bye, and I jump back out, because one of the options is you can just jump away from the fight completely. And so the fighting aspect from the character side, from the actual like doing trials and dungeons and things like that, it's so, what you were mentioning was showing the actual like mechanics at the bottom, or one of the ones that was introduced in Shadowbringers was the spinning one. And so it has like this kind of blue arrow and it makes it go, it'll show that it's going to start spinning and you're like, what? And I was running around like, do I have to spin in a circle? And then you see like this character going whap, whap, whap and going around in like a like clockwise circle. And I'm like, oh, I should probably be running now. So I'm like trying to run around, and obviously, as a tank, sometimes you get to miss those opportunities because your thing is you're the main tank, just fight the boss. Sometimes you get to like move away, and in ARR, I definitely felt that a lot where I'm just like, oh, everyone else gets to stack up with each other and be able to run around and like try to like deal with ads and stuff like that. And I'm like, hey, can I help? And they're like, deal with the boss. But then when you get into later fights, they're like, okay, so the boss is completely preoccupied or trying to summon something. Now you have to go to certain parts of the actual floor or you're going to die. If I end up doing a savage trial of Leviathan and I live, it'll be my first time. I will never be able to live through Leviathan.
Oh my God.
For people who aren't familiar, it is like a platform, and halfway through they just take the railings off and they're like, good luck. If you're on the wrong side, you're going into the deep. And every single time, like clockwork, I think I get it, and then I'm just swept away into the ocean, and I'm like, bye guys, have fun. And they're like, it's fine, we can do this ourselves. And I'm like, I'm happy you can, because
that's why there's two tanks, right? Like just in case someone falls in the water. Because one of the things I like about some of the not crazy instances, as well as when you're tanking, is that you really only have to have one tank for the boss, and then the other one can just focus on a lot of the other mechanics, like if there's ads or something like that, or for the most part they just focus on damage, and then you don't really need to tank swap nearly as much as World of Warcraft, which is nice. Like I kind of like that about the tanking in this game, or the other tank is really just there as a backup in case they die, and then you have the other person take over while the other person's being rezzed, essentially. I like that about tanking in this game a lot, actually, which is nice. But
yeah, it's very helpful, and I appreciate the fact that it's, at least for myself, when I did play things like a Death Knight or I played a Druid, people are like, okay, you need to bring 3 gear sets and you need to be able to go as heals, you need to go as an off tank, you need to do DPS, then go into off tank, and you're just like, okay, let me just take a moment to put on all this gear and then take off this gear to change on it. No, this is very straightforward, but each and every class is significantly different, but it's fantastic. And it's not too difficult in some cases. If you're going for myself, I was not expecting to play DPS. I'm not usually a DPS person. I'm either heals or tank, and I usually overlook DPS, but for some of the DPS, they add a lot to the raid. And so I'm like, this actually makes me feel significant if I'm going into a raid. Like I have the ability to res people or do a patch heal or do anything else. There are some DPS that are just like, I'm here for the DPS and that's it. I can't do anything else. GG's, good luck. But for the rest of us, we're like, okay. But no, I think you can tell that this game, when it comes mechanic wise, they think about it. Other than Living Dead, Final Fantasy XIV, please fix Living Dead.
It's the one bad tank cooldown. It's the only one that's bad.
The one out of every single one. You have a fantastic, just a line of fantastic tanks, and then you have Living Dead. And then if I just randomly every so often I will press it just for the gags, and then sometimes I die because someone didn't heal me up to 100% after I went to 0, and I'm like, you know what? I deserved this. This is where I should be at the moment. But no, they really put in the time and effort and really thought through, because some games are like, okay, we'll just have a tank, we'll just have a DPS. But this is, okay, here's a tank, but how can their mechanics like really reflect their type of character or the type of role that they're doing? And so it's just so enticing that way, because it's also really flashy. I like the flash. Obviously, I'm Dark Knight. For people who know, Dark Knights are very flashy. They have a bunch of AoEs. People think that they're standing in the wrong thing because you're summoning like a dark ether portal, and they're like, no, it's fine. It's just my AoE. And they're like, I thought I had to run out of it. And I'm like, you're fine. And
Well, you're taught not to stand in the red stuff, and you keep putting red stuff on the ground.
Exactly. The moment that like my team got very confused. The newer people who were playing were like, I keep on running out. And so some people had to turn off their like actual visuals because they were getting so confused. Did not help later on during raids, but during dungeons it helped them, I guess.
I mean, it's definitely something, yeah, because I normally play as Gunbreaker when I play tank, and it's also very flashy, but that's one of the things I kind of love about it. But what I like about that one is how different it feels from a lot of the other tanks, because it almost feels like a DPS class, because you have a bunch of different combos and stuff like that, and I kind of really like it. It almost feels like I'm playing like as Dante from Devil May Cry or something like that, but it's a tank. So I really enjoyed that. Also, shout out to the one paladin ability that I'm kind of blanking on at the moment, where you just take no damage. So you can just stand in whatever for 10 seconds, which is just so much more useful than Living Dead, where you're just like, yeah, I'll just stoke up whatever mechanic is here and I won't take a damage, and it's totally cool. So don't even have to worry about healing me. And
always jealous.
Moving over to healers, one of the things I love about healers in this game is that I love the emphasis on not just healing in this game, but also dealing damage and kind of learning the push and pull that comes along with that, and knowing kind of when to DPS and kind of when to heal, and kind of being a little more strategic with your actions, especially as Scholar, which is kind of my main, which I know gets kind of a lot of flack nowadays, especially with kind of their changes in Endwalker, which are interesting to say the least. But I really like kind of their shielding mechanics and kind of having a little pet that kind of heals along with you. Like, I love that mechanic, but also you have to be pretty strategic when you play as kind of a shielding healer, because obviously you have to make sure that you have to play it a little bit more ahead than just doing being a pure healing class, like something like White Mage or something like that. So I kind of love the idea of doing that, and then either slamming my book on the ground to do my AoE, or just, spamming Ruin or Broil over and over again is kind of my jam. So I love the healers as well, because they all feel really different from each other. Like Astrologian in particular is one that I never thought would actually exist in an MMO, where essentially you're like healing your allies while dealing damage, while you also have this card mechanic. So you're drawing cards from a deck that also buff different party members depending on which card you draw. Like it's just really involved, and it seems like on paper it would feel like overly complex, but when you're in the midst of the game, it just feels like super natural to play. And I love just kind of the gameplay style that's associated with each of the healers, even though I do think White Mage is kind of a little boring, because you really don't ever run out of mana, and you have giant heals, and you just cast Glare a whole bunch of times, and away you go. Like that's kind of what White Mage is all about. But I'm really interested to play the new class Sage. Like, I think it looks awesome, and it's going to be a lot of fun to play. And then DPS, to your point, I love how involved they are, and you can be as involved or not involved you are as you want to be, depending on what class you want to play. Like, if you just want to DPS, you can just be a samurai or black mage if you want to just, focus on doing your own thing. I really like playing as monk, actually, as a DPS class that I've actually really drifted to. The thing that I like about it is I like the fact that you've got positional attacks, which might sound kind of annoying, because depending on where you're standing around the boss, you do either more damage or less damage. But I kind of like that it gets me kind of moving around the boss in an interesting way, and making sure I plan out my specific attacks in my combo, so that I know like where to stand for each one. I kind of like the way that it bounces the gameplay that way. And then I like a lot of the ranged melee classes. So stuff like Machinist or Bard or Dancer. I like all those classes as well. So there you go. But I'm the type of person that you kind of described at the beginning of the show, Fee, who's actually leveled all the classes or all the jobs to 80, because I am, in fact, that person. So there you go. I've had my chance to play all of them, but that's what I like playing. So there you go. But we would be remiss if we were talking about Final Fantasy XIV and we didn't talk about one aspect that we haven't talked about yet, which I'm actually kind of surprised about, and that is the music of Final Fantasy XIV, done by Soken over at Square Enix, as well as his brand, The Primals, as well as kind of a bunch of other artists that guest on certain songs. Holy crap, the music in this game is amazing. From the trial and dungeon themes to even just when you're exploring the world, or the fact that when you have certain mounts the music that's associated with either that boss or that location will start playing. Like if you ride the Final Fantasy VII motorcycle, it has the music from the chase scene from Final Fantasy VII playing. I love all that stuff. But Fee, if you had do you have a favorite song from Final Fantasy XIV or a list of favorite songs? What do you think about the music?
Okay, so a serious answer would be the opening song for Heaven's Word. That song gets me every single time, and I actually was listening to that before we started recording because I'm like, this is my how to get hyped for Final Fantasy XIV. Shadowbringers also had a phenomenal, and I appreciate the fact that every opening song they're all linked together. If you listen to them like back to back, they have like, they kind of build on the last one and kind of like either make it more edgy or make it like with Stormblood, it was like more robust and like, we're all going to war. And then when it came to Shadowbringers, as some people on the internet like to call it, depression bringers,
yep.
It became a lot more solemn, but it still had a lot of power behind it. I would have to say, for like the laughs, but also because it's probably one of my favorite videos of all time. I heard this song constantly. Even though I'm in my late 20s, I still use TikTok. And there was this one song that just kept on coming up that kept on saying the same two things over and over again, which was Lahi. And I'm like, okay, you know what? I really appreciate this. And Harv's like, if I can get you, like, I know you've been playing for like a week or so, but watch this video. And it was Soken at the 2020
the fan fest.
The fan fest. And he just comes out and he's like, Lahi. And I'm like, oh my God. I love this game. I love Soken. I love the people who just let this man stand on a stage live and just record him sing this.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh. The music is absolutely phenomenal, but every single time, if anyone ever asks me about the music, I cannot think of Lahi. I know some people think of like Twinnings and stuff like that, and they're like, that's the best song. And I'm like, but Lahi exists, guys. Do you not know this particular masterpiece exists? So no, I'd probably have to say, like, serious answer would be the openings of like Heaven's Ward and just the music that way, because Heaven's Ward had such a resounding like effect on me that if I listen to that music, I'm like, this is it. I would probably have to say it's like a masterpiece, like from start to finish. The music itself, they thought about it like every single note and just thought of, okay, this is the type of story that we're telling during this expansion. And they do it with the others, but just Heaven's Ward itself just hits a little bit harder for me. And so the music's phenomenal, but Lahi would have to be the...
Well, actually, like I love when I first heard that song and going into that zone for the first time in Shadowbringers, like I basically would like get off my mountain, just walk around the forest, just listening to that song. It's like, this song's awesome. Like I actually, like, that was one of my favorite songs from Shadowbringers. But yeah, going back to kind of my favorite songs and my serious answer, I mean, the Shadowbringers main theme for me personally kind of hits kind of a sweet spot for me personally, because it kind of brings out both the modern Final Fantasy XIV player in me with kind of the main guitar riff, but then also the callback to the Crystal Tower theme from Final Fantasy III, because I really love Final Fantasy III. So just hearing that kind of nostalgic theme it kind of play into there, and just the way they do it on the violin, it's so perfect. But of course the twinning, gotta say the twinning, give a shout out to that, as well as the boss theme from Alexander from Heaven's Ward was so good. Like I would just jam out to it all the time. So that's another song I really enjoyed. And then even some of the old ARR songs, like going back and listening to some of those, like the Fate theme that I'm just blanking on the name of right now. I think it's like Hard to Miss, I think is what it's called. But that song is just really incredible because it's got this great guitar riff and then it's got some violins mixed in, and it's just a bunch of like a hodgepodge of genres all coming together, and I really enjoy that music too. So yeah, I mean the Final Fantasy XIV soundtrack, for those that haven't looked it up yet, it's on Spotify, and it's like 400 songs long. If you want to go listen to it, it's like 10 hours long if you want to listen to it across all the games. So there's a ton of music in this game, and there's a ton of great songs to choose from. But definitely the music, ever since day one, from the very first time I stepped out into the forest of Gridania and kind of listened to the music there, and kind of running around the North Shroud, for example, like just listening to that music in particular, just I love it. It's so good, especially for someone like me who's a big music person. Listening to the music in the game is really awesome. Well, speaking of great music, I want to talk a little bit about the dungeons, the trials, the raids, and the ultimates a little bit, because some of the best music I think in the game actually exists in some of these areas as well. But we should talk at least about these as well. So obviously, a lot of the earlier dungeons are more like tutorial dungeons, but one of the things I really like about the dungeons in Final Fantasy XIV in particular, especially like a lot of the later dungeons, is they're really, the way they're kind of integrated into the story itself. Like it feels like you're actually going to a dungeon in like a real place that it could exist. Almost like the same feeling I had kind of exploring some of the dungeons in something like Skyrim, for example. Yeah. Like when you go explore like a mine in there, something that feels like a real place that could exist. And especially with like some of the Shadowbringers dungeons or the Heavensward dungeons, like going through the Citadel, for example, in Heavensward, like it feels like a real place that you're kind of exploring. So I definitely really love the dungeon design in this game. But what do you think about some of the dungeons in this game, Fee?
Honestly, like you said, it feels like it's just its own thing in itself. Like I remember and the people that were in my like in my light party when I was going through Doma Castle, I apologize because I just kept on taking photos because I'm like, why is no one else freaking out about this? This is stunning. Everything about this, like you walk into this massive like building and the architecture and just every single area, nook and cranny of that room. I can't describe it to you guys without one, spoiling, and two, just like I don't want to spoil it for you. It is absolutely phenomenal. And I'm just like, I don't think I've ever seen something like this. Just even for like a small dungeon, like MMO wise, I can't think of one off the top of my head. Just a dungeon in itself, not talking about raids or trials or anything like that, but just a dungeon, just one particular room. I'm like, that is overwhelmingly beautiful. Like the amount of work that they put in each and every one. And you can tell, like, yes, in the like lore ones, I'm like, this definitely gives me reminiscence of like playing early World of Warcraft dungeons. But then like Shadowfang Keep definitely gave me some like, it definitely reminded me of like some of the some of the earlier dungeons remind me a lot of like Shadowfang Keep, which is a pretty well-known dungeon from World of Warcraft. But the later ones, I'm just like, okay, when we hit Heavensward and we got into some of those dungeons, I'm like, okay, they definitely do not mess around. And then when we got into Stormblood, even though Stormblood really story-wise as well as just overall wasn't my favorite, the dungeons and trials made up for it. I'm like, this was definitely a very good expansion because of the dungeons and the trials, because they put so much work into it. I didn't even get to experience all of them, and I definitely want to go back because we have been trying to get through the story as a group before Endwalker came out. But what I got to experience, I was very, very happy. So I even say, talked about this a while ago as well. I would probably have to say Stormblood probably has some of my favorite dungeons because of how much work they put into it.
Yeah. And especially with some of the like really creative, like visual design of some of those dungeons in particular, like even some of like one of the early ones that I remember going to, which was like the underwater city, like, oh my God, that dungeon in particular looks incredible. So yeah, I love the Stormblood dungeons, especially like, even though you're kind of forced to doing a lot of kind of side dungeons when you do kind of the post expansion content that kind of is the in-between between two expansions, sometimes you might feel like they might be a write-off, but they're always really well designed too. In fact, some of those ones are probably my favorite dungeons that you actually go into, or even some of the ones in Stormblood, for example, that are totally optional. Like there's an entire series of dungeons and trials that are completely optional that I think is some of the best content in that entire expansion. So you could totally miss it if you kind of blink or you're kind of focus it on going through the main scenario quests as quickly as possible. But yeah, ultimately, I think dungeon design is super well done. Also, one of the things that's cool that is one of the new features in Shadowbringers that they introduced is the trust system, which allows you to go through the story dungeons with the Scions of the Seventh Dawn, essentially. So if you don't want to play with other players, you don't really feel forced to do so. Or like sometimes if I'm playing through the story and it's late at night and I don't want to randomly match up with some pugs or something like that, like I'll just run through the dungeon that way and just get it over with. Like especially for a DPS only like player, like I think that I would feel like super thankful for something like that being in there, because sometimes, you know, you're waiting for 15 to 20 minutes to get in queue for the one story dungeon you need to get into in order to progress the story. So it's something that I really hope they kind of find a way to work into some of the older content, so then people can have a chance to use that. Even though, again, I always prefer to play with human players. I like having the options available to you. And there is a system like it that's in the older content called Squadrons, which is part of your grand company that you basically join after level 30 or a certain point in the story. That you basically are AI characters that you can play along with that are part of the grand company themselves. And they're kind of dumb, but at the same time, they can usually get the job done if you want to kind of level some of your other jobs up and whatnot. So I do like that there's stuff in there for that. But then we got to talk about the trials, because this is something that's kind of unique to this game as well. They're kind of almost like raid bosses that are segmented by themselves with no trash or anything like that. You're basically just there's cinematic plays and you're pretty much right at the boss, essentially. And at first, all the trials were all based off primals from like the summon characters from the previous Final Fantasy games. But then as the expansions have gone on, I've really loved what they've done with trials and kind of the design with all the characters going forward. And I really love the trial series in this game. But Fee, what about you? What do you think about the trials, and do you have a favorite trial?
Yeah, so I was definitely like, when I first heard about what trials were, I'm like, okay, so wait, there's no ads. And they're like, no. And I'm like, okay, so it's just we fight one particular person. And then I'm like, okay, that definitely seems weird. But then once I actually understood, like, some of them are definitely story based and some of them are just side trials, but I think they're really, like, they're needed. There are definitely some times when, and I know I just brought up Stormblood, but Stormblood had probably one of my favorites, if I could remember it off the top of my head, and I am looking for it because it is definitely a very good one. While I'm talking, I'll definitely find it. But it's so interesting to see how they took like one particular boss, because usually for people of like veterans of MMOs like us, we're used to those big raids where you have to do like tons and tons of ads, and then you finally get to that one boss, and then okay, that's done. And so then you go continue on, and you're just like, not so great. And it's Castrum Fulminus.
Okay.
Fulminus.
Yeah.
So yeah, that one in particular hit hard. But there were definitely some other ones. I joke around about Leviathan, but I also really enjoy the mechanic because they think about the entire area, and it's not just the boss itself. Like, they think about the entire like enclosure that they're in, like what aspects like they have specific mechanics that are associated with that one in particular. Or oh my goodness, I keep on like, there's so many that just like randomly pop up in my head as I'm talking. But like Shiva, for example, it's her, like, that particular trial was absolutely phenomenal. And the music itself, because I joke around every time we go through it, because I'm like, this definitely sounds like halfway through, because sometimes what will happen in a trial, they'll change up the music after a certain point in time. And it definitely sounds as though it is the end of a season of anime, and it's like very much like, we can do this, guys. And I'm like, I'm sorry, like everyone who I'm like playing.
The J-pop kicks in and you know it's time to kick up the jams and kill the boss faster.
Exactly. And it just gets you hyped, because you're like, okay, this is really cool. But there's so many different, like, I know I constantly gush about this, but you can tell they've taken their time, and they were like, okay, this particular character sits on a head, for example. I'm not going to talk about further than that, but they have so many different things associated with that. I'm like, oh, so that makes sense why this particular character ended up the way that they did, or how these particular scenarios get to place. I am really happy that they exist. When I first, like I said, I was definitely hesitant because of what I was used to previously, because I thought, like, this seems kind of silly. But like King Moogelmog.
Yep.
I'm going to end off with
it's got a bop in there. I mean, it's got a really good, it's got such a good jam. And I love, especially with like the different difficulties for that particular trial, and like how different the hard mode is versus the savage. Like, I really love kind of the difference between the two of them, and how they really differentiated them, the two of them. They feel like two completely different fights, which is just amazing to see. I to your point, I really love the music in the trials. I think definitely that a lot of the best music comes from a lot of the trials, and like you, especially when you do the very first trial, is like, I don't know if I'm really going to get into these, like if I really love the idea of doing the trials, but I don't know. I love the idea of just not having to deal with trash and just going straight to the boss, especially like so many nights of just wasting time just killing trash in like ICC or like other raids in World of Warcraft. I'm just like, please, if I never have to fight trash again in any other MMO, I'll be happy. So I love just focusing on the mechanics. Actually, one of the bosses in Stormblood from one of the trials that I really love, and this is kind of a spoiler, but not really, because this was part of a special promotion with Monster Hunter, is fighting Rathlos from the Monster Hunter series. You fight him as a trial. And one of the things I really like about that fight is that halfway through the fight, you basically have this like access to at any time to this super potion, which is one of the items in Monster Hunter that restores your health. And you're like, hey, I wonder why I have this item. Well, apparently when you get to the halfway point of the fight, the music totally changes and the visuals change, and your healers can no longer heal any of the party members. So in order to actually heal your party, you have to drink the super potion, kind of like you would in Monster Hunter, and you basically have to take care of your own health. So I thought that crossover with Monster Hunter was done in an awesome way. Like, it was such a refreshing idea to take some of the mechanics from Monster Hunter and then bring them into this game. You also have to deal with like staggering the boss by attacking certain parts of the boss, which again, you would do in Monster Hunter if you're playing that game. So I love just how the way they incorporated all of that stuff together and how it kind of meshed. So that's one of the most memorable bosses from Stormblood, I think, is the Rathlos fight from Monster Hunter is super cool. And then, of course, you've got your traditional raids, but raids in this game kind of work the same way as trials do, and they're almost like buffed version of the trials anyways. At least the 8-man raids are. You also have 24-person alliance raids as well, which are basically kind of the more traditional MMO raids where you have trash and you're running to bosses. And most of those alliance raids are actually crossovers with other games. So the Stormblood one was a crossover with the Evilus timeline of Final Fantasy, so stuff like Final Fantasy Tactics or Final Fantasy XII. And then with Shadowbringers, they crossed over with Nier, and they worked Nier Automata somehow into the canon of Final Fantasy XIV, which is just so goofy to see, but I love the way they kind of implement it. So, but Alliance raids I've just never really been super into, because again, I don't really love... Now that I've kind of been spoiled by trials, I don't love running through like trash mobs and stuff like that in order to get to a boss that sometimes has more complicated mechanics that like pug groups, for example, really struggle with. But I love like the smaller 8-man raids. I think those have always been really solid, and sometimes those are crossovers too. But again, I'm not going to spoil any of those, but I really love how those are implemented. Have you really had a chance to play around with a lot of the raids? I know you're mainlining the story, so I don't know how much time you've had with it, besides Crystal Tower, which is a requirement now at this point.
Yes, which I was definitely going to bring up, Crystal Tower, because that one is, after completing the game in its entirety, was really great. But yeah, I honestly, after like playing World of Warcraft and playing with like the larger raid groups and even just dealing with like LFR and stuff like that, I'm just like, if I do not have to do an alliance raid again, I'm going to avoid it. Because it is just so chaotic. And I've been in groups where, okay, so my team's doing great, but I just see team A died.
Yep.
Like, what am I supposed to do now? Like, okay, I'm going to go over here and, I'm dead now because Team B died on mechanics that they should have been doing instead. And it's too much. But no, I think just some of the smaller ones are definitely a lot more enticing. I did get to play a little bit of the one at the end of Shadowbringers. Okay,
the Eden raids.
Eden, yes. So I got to do a little bit of Eden because I wanted to get that gear set for my Dark Knight so I could look crazy.
The Eden sets in particular are actually really cool. So.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of statues, and so I really wanted to get that kind of vibe. And so I wanted to at least try it out, because I didn't get to do the near raid my group got to one night because I was too tired. I'm like, I am 4 hours ahead of all of you. I need to go to sleep. And so they went and did near. But I'll definitely jump into the other raids later on. That it's what I want to do, because I want to experience things that I haven't been able to during this kind of like, it's definitely not a rush by any stretch, but it was definitely the main focus was to get through the main storyline, making sure that I was doing certain portions to be able to get to certain areas and stuff like that. So to a point that I don't have flying anywhere in Shadowbringers. Everyone has to fly me everywhere. Thank goodness my team has 2 people mounts, because I would be still in Lahi while everyone else finished patch 5.3. Like I would just be like, hi guys. So it's,
you're not joining too many hunt trains anytime soon, I'm guessing.
No,
which all require flying.
Yeah, I did. Whenever I do a hunt train and stuff like that, I go with one of the people that I actually went through this. Harv is the person, because he has the newest purchasable mount. That is a massive robot. So we just fly around with that. No idea what it's from, but apparently it's a great portion of Final Fantasy that I do not know about.
I think with that one in particular, I think you'll find out when you go back and do some of the older raids.
Yeah.
That's all I'm going to say about it. So,
but no, it was definitely an interesting experience to see what a 24-man is outside of World of Warcraft. Because at one point I did get to see what a 40-man looked like, and I never want to ever experience that ever in my life again.
Oh, I used to put those together. Those were always fun to coordinate and get going.
I thought 24-mans were too much, let alone 40. But I think it's definitely something I want to experience later on. I just haven't had nearly enough experience during these sections.
For sure. And also one of the cool things about the raids in this game too is just how they work into the story, because they all really play in a lot of different ways. Now, quick question for you, because this is something I'm going to recommend to anyone who's new to the game. Ooh. But did you actually end up playing the Coils of Bahamut before jumping into Heavensward at all?
So I got through, I think, half of Coil.
Okay.
I think I'm actually very much wrong, because I know we got to the hand. And so as someone who has played it, you understand fighting in the hand. That was essentially the extent of what we got to. So that is the extent of what we got, because that was another thing. We were doing essentially a weekly raid, and then we're like, we need to take that night to actually do the main story quest. Yeah. So we had to put that on a pause. But I really want to go back, probably even just like without Echo on, and just go straight through it.
I was going to say, you can solo most of it, with the exception of like 2 bosses. So but it's definitely worth going back to. Anyone who's a new player, make sure to play Coils of Bahamut before jumping into Heavensward. It totally changes your perspective on it. And it actually changes some of the dialogue options too. Like what you were talking about before with some of the class dialogue options, or the location dialogue options. There's also like, because it's really focused on Alice as an example, and the way she talks to you in Heavensward is completely different, with completely different choices if you've done Coils of Bahamut versus if you haven't. So it's actually really interesting to go back there. So it's a type of content that I feel like should be mandatory, because it's really the true end to ARR in a lot of ways. And I really hope they make it so that everyone has to play it, just like Crystal Tower, because it adds so much to the story that it feels almost incomplete without it. So I would definitely recommend making sure to go back to it. Or anyone who's new, who's jumping in for the first time, definitely make sure to do Coils of Bahamut. And then, of course, last but not least, the ultimate challenge, the Ultimates, which are interesting as well. Obviously, I know you haven't gotten to any of those. I've done Ultimates before, and they're always interesting. They're really like the truest challenge in the game, where essentially you're fighting like 8 different bosses, essentially, without dying or losing, and like most of the fights are 20 minutes long, so, with like epic music and some fantastic rewards for going through it. But usually, if you want to clear one, like clear your calendar, you're going to be spending 2 weeks trying to take down this one ultimate. So I love the way the ultimates are designed, though, and they're kind of all based on past boss encounters across either previous raids or previous trials, and they kind of remix all the themes from all of those trials or raids, and they incorporate some old mechanics and mix them with new mechanics that make them like super interesting to play through. So it's definitely like the highest of the high tier content in FF14, and it's definitely something that like I really enjoy doing, even though it's just bashing your head against the wall for hours upon hours. But the satisfaction when you beat it is pretty impressive. So there you go. And I think that kind of rounds out everything we kind of wanted to talk about with the main game itself. But I have to ask you this, because this episode originally was going to come out the same day as early access was going to start for Endwalker, but it got delayed until December 7th. Well, the early access starts on the 3rd. So I got to ask you, now that you're almost at the Endwalker content, what do you want from Endwalker, Fee?
Oh man. Well, I really want to see how the story ends. And I know that's what everyone wants. And I know for a lot of people, this has been a decade in the making. But obviously, for myself, I am a little bit lucky coming in almost at the end of the race saying like, hey, I'm going to make it. And everyone else has been like, we've been here for a decade. What are you talking about? But I've been so excited watching all the live letters, which, by the way, once again, hashtag blame Harv. I experienced my first live letter, not the new one that just came out recently, but it was the one beforehand.
Yep.
And I thought
the
it was just
6 hour
gonna be
one, of course.
I didn't know it was I thought it was gonna be an hour, Ryan. I thought it was an hour. He told me it's gonna start at 11 your time. I'm like, okay. By the end, I had a blanket wrapped around me like a burrito. I had it over my head, and you could just see my face and my glasses because it was almost 6 a.m. in the morning, my time. And I had written, I think 30 pages was where I like finished, because I enjoy writing notes when I'm watching things like that. And the same thing happened during the latest one, even though it was relatively shorter. But I just really want to see where they take the game. Also, I'm very excited to try Reaper. Mind you, I am probably going to just level up my Dark Knight first, because I know for a fact it's going to be easy for me to find dungeons, not for DPS, because everyone's going to be playing that Reaper.
Yeah. Well, even the healer queues might be backed up too, with everyone trying to play Sage at this point too, which happens almost every expansion. As someone who's, played at the start of every expansion for Final Fantasy XIV, it's always just like, you don't ever want to share the same type of class as like the new ones, or else it's just going to take forever to find.
So dungeons. I'm just going to tank. I'm just like, you know what? I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing currently. By like going into, for it being my first like new expansion, which I bought the digital deluxe edition back in June, because I'm like, I'm invested at this point. I'm spending the almost $100 Canadian on this game, because I am here for the long haul. And so I really want to see like what they do. Like, it has been really nice to be able to see a lot of like mechanic wise for our classes and our jobs. And so going into it, I'm like, we get to go to areas that we didn't expect before. And I know with me explaining it currently, I'm explaining it almost in a broad sense, because obviously I don't want to spoil it for some people who are going to be playing it. But there's the small glimpses that we've seen just make me really want to get into it. And when Yoshi P had to explain, bless him, Yoshi P coming on and being like, I am so sorry that we have to delay it 2 weeks. I'm like, you take all the time that you need. I originally had tomorrow off. I don't currently have it off anymore, but I had it for this particular game. And I'm like, it's fine. If you want to take an extra 2 weeks because you wanted to make it the game that you all wanted, by all means, take your time. Like, I appreciate when people do that. And so there's just so many things that I want, but at the same time, I know I'm going to be happy with the game because of everything they've already shown. I'm like, I am invested. So I am very excited to not only see what's going to be happening during the first early access time, because I'm going to be playing on December 3rd. Absolutely. But just being able to experience it finally, because now I'm not going to be constantly hearing from people who've played for a long time. Back in my day when I was playing Heaven's Ward, or, I did 5.3 2 years ago. And I'm like,
wait a second. That sounds like the conversation you and I have been having for an hour.
No. Here's the thing. Once again, blame Harv, because Harv will be like, I will tell you half of the mechanics. And I'm like, okay, so when we get to Endwalker and I get to actually read all the fighting thing or like mechanics and stuff like that, or looking into certain things, I get to experience it with everyone else for the first time. And that's, you know what? That's the best answer I can give. I get to finally experience this game for the first time with everybody else. And so that's what's getting me really excited.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that I will warn you about is get ready for the long queue times. That's as far as just logging into the servers. But, everything else, like every other expansion has been, pretty smooth sailing. So that's one thing that Final Fantasy XIV has always been great at. But yeah, same here. Like, I'm very excited to get into it as a longtime player. I am very excited to see how the story is going to end, this long, 10-year story that they've kind of been telling. But I'm also really interested to see kind of how the post game content it's going to work in this expansion as well, because they're going to be introducing some kind of new threat or new story that the Warrior of Light's going to be going on at some point. So I'm curious to know where they kind of go with the story from here, past like the kind of the main arc kind of ending. But yeah, I'm really excited to explore some of the new zones. I've been looking at some of the videos, but not looking too much at them because I don't want to get super spoiled on some of the stuff. Of course. But I love kind of the design of some of the new zones. Also, I love a lot of the callbacks to a certain other Final Fantasy game from the past that I'm not going to mention here for spoiler reasons. But as someone who's been playing Final Fantasy since the Super Nintendo days, I'm very excited to see where how that's going to influence the story or the direction of where they kind of go with this. And yeah, I'm just excited to jump into the community. I know that the Final Fantasy XIV community has just grown so much in the last year in particular. Like, I'm really excited to see people like Yuffie who are new to the game jumping in and experiencing a new expansion for the first time and getting that experience that we've known for a long time, us longtime players. And I think it's going to be super fun. Like, I think there's going to be so many more people to play with. And yes, there's going to be a ton of Reapers and Sages out there that you're going to you're just going to be running in dungeons with, but that's okay. That happens every expansion for the first, month. And then everyone kind of gets over that. It's just like when Shadowbringers came out, and I remember that it took me at least 2 weeks to get a dungeon of some kind that didn't have a gunbreaker in it, essentially. So
wow.
Yeah, it's going to be really cool to do that. Plus, I know Yoshi P's talked about how the Duty Finder is going to be retooled a little bit, where it's going to really be balancing kind of different jobs. Like if there's a bunch of Reapers in queue, for example, you're not going to run into dungeons where there's a Sage healing with 2 Reapers and a tank, whatever tank kind of queued up with them. He says it's going to be a little bit better balanced out like that, which will be nice, which means if you play something like Machinist, you'll probably actually have less queue times than if you play Reaper at the beginning. But yeah, I'm just super excited for it to come out. It's one of my most anticipated games of the year, and in a year where we've had a lot of fantastic titles, I cannot be more excited for Endwalker to come out in 2 weeks. And I just can't wait to start playing the game with everyone else. So we'll definitely be talking about it again on the show. So look out for that in the future. But that's all the time we have for this episode of the RPG Cave. But before we go, feed plugs go.
Absolutely. So you can find me over on Point in Progress. We live stream our main podcast on Fridays at around 8:30 Eastern. We also have our Final Fantasy podcast called Fantasy in Progress. The newest episode that's going to be coming out is about Stormblood. The one that we're recording probably after this is about Shadowbringers, so that is a spoiler for all of you. And you can also find me on Speaking of Stadia, where I talk about Stadia with 2 of my great friends, Jake and Aaron, and it is every other Tuesday we get to sit down and talk about Stadia. And you can also find me streaming online at twitch.tv/Serenix. I play indie games, I do art, I also play a lot of Final Fantasy XIV because that is 100% what I'm into right now. So you can check me out all on those places, and you can find out when I'm live and when things are being released over on my Twitter at Zeranix. So Z, because I am Canadian, ZURANIIX.
With 2 eyes. Yeah,
2 eyes.
Obviously. And as for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You can find us on Twitter at Yumi Capri's, on YouTube at youtube.com/Yumi Capri, and on podcast services around the globe. So for Fiona MacKinnon, I'm Ryan Turford. This has been level 26 of the RPG Cave, and we're out. The RPG Cave's mana is fueled by patrons over at patreon.com/YumiCapri. And I want to say thanks to each and every one of our Patreon supporters for all of your support throughout the years, as well as supporting our independent content. And let's start by thanking our premium producers, Dallas Ford, Lee Navarro, the fearless leader of the Phoenix Overdrive Extra Life team, and Jonathan Brown. You can find his content over at youtube.com/PM Entertainment. Our platinum producers, Robbie Bobby Mailer and Trucker Sloth. And our gold members, Argo, Brendan Myers, Dallas Robbins, Emily O'Kelly, Heather Boney, James Johnson, Joel Brooks, Jose Jimenez, Mac Time, Benji Kong, Marcus O'Neill, RJ Kern, Dano, Skinny Matt, Mr. and Mrs. Nasty Boots, Foolish Fuji, and Xavier Reyes. Thank you all for all of your support.